This is the second installment in the Battle of Carentan story, told through the recollections of 2nd Lieutenant Ronald Speirs, commander of 2nd Platoon Dog Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. Most people know Speirs today from the television series Band of Brothers, but these events come directly from his own account of the fighting. The story focuses on the Battle of Bloody Gulch and the fierce German counterattack that followed the American capture of Carentan. On the 13th of June, Speirs received orders to clear a farmhouse located on the regiment's right flank. Before dawn, the battalion's 81mm mortar platoon opened fire on the objective. The bombardment was intense, and the roof of the farmhouse was soon engulfed in flames. As Dog Company advanced, the men moved down a slope toward the farm, which was surrounded by a stone wall. It was during this approach that the German counterattack began. Art DiMarzio later remembered that as soon as they reached the farmhouse, German troops opened fire. In his words, all hell let loose. The Battle of Bloody Gulch was underway. Almost immediately, heavy German mortar and artillery fire crashed into the area. One rifleman was hit and left wounded in the open. Seeking shelter from the barrage, the men of 2nd Platoon scrambled into the courtyard of the burning farmhouse. As enemy fire intensified, Speirs quickly realized the seriousness of their situation. Looking back over the wall, he saw German soldiers advancing through the hedgerows the Americans had only recently occupied. The stone wall provided little real protection. From the west, where hedgerows blocked visibility, German troops began tossing grenades into the enclosure. Speirs later recalled the explosions tearing through the confined space, sending hot fragments in every direction. Shrapnel struck him in the right temple and knee, knocking him to the ground. Dazed and in pain, with his ears ringing, he watched as German fire targeted the platoon's machine gunner, who lay exposed near the gate. The gunner was killed, and the weapon rendered useless. Soon afterward, German paratroopers launched a frontal assault. Speirs remembered them advancing to within about 25 yards while firing as they came. Despite the pressure, the platoon met the attack with concentrated small arms fire, cutting down the attackers before they could reach the wall. As the fighting raged on, Dog and Fox companies were forced to pull back, leaving Speirs and his platoon isolated inside the burning farm enclosure. The German counterattack had effectively halted the American advance. According to Speirs, it was clear that the enemy intended to retake Carentan. Although wounded, Speirs knew they could not remain where they were. The burning farmhouse filled the area with heat and smoke, and the walls offered no protection from grenades. While searching for a way out, he spotted a drainage ditch that wound back toward the battalion's position. It appeared to be the only viable escape route. Calling out, "2nd Platoon on me!" he led the men out at a run. They covered roughly 400 yards uphill before reaching friendly lines. Exhausted, the men of Dog Company practically collapsed into their foxholes. Yet Speirs quickly learned that the situation elsewhere had deteriorated. Fox Company had withdrawn once again to higher ground, approximately 100 yards behind its previous position. The move had been made without authorization from Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer. Speirs believed the withdrawal exposed the entire left flank and ran contrary to sound tactical judgment. Looking back years later, however, Speirs acknowledged that he had not known about a column of German armor advancing toward Fox Company's position. That threat heavily influenced their decision to fall back, especially since they were running dangerously low on ammunition. Whatever the reasons, Dog Company now had to move into position to close the gap between EZ and Fox companies. Many soldiers were understandably reluctant to leave the relative safety of their foxholes. Speirs described them as frightened, but not panicked. To keep the enemy pinned down in the hedgerows, steady fire had to be maintained. He urged his men to give everything they had to the fight. Lieutenant Thomas Peacock kept ammunition flowing to the front by delivering it in jeep loads. Nearby, Battalion Mortar Platoon leader Frederick Moose Heiliger and his crew fired more than 1,000 rounds at German positions. What Speirs and the battalion did not know at the time was that reinforcements were already moving toward them. Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division had been rushed east of Carentan to meet an anticipated German thrust that never developed. At around 2 p.m., the men of the 2nd Battalion heard a welcome sound: the approach of 60 Sherman tanks, M5 light tanks, and self-propelled howitzers. Speirs later described the sight as beautiful. The tanks advanced while firing and performed superbly. Their arrival turned the tide of the battle, pushing the Germans back beyond Avers and preserving the critical link between the American beachheads in Normandy Following the battle, Speirs' platoon returned to Carentan and was placed in reserve. Only 50 men remained in Dog Company. Reflecting on the ordeal, Speirs remarked that it was remarkable there were not more cases of combat exhaustion. Despite being forced to give ground, most of the men fought courageously and fulfilled their role in defending the town. That evening, however, the platoon learned the fate of Dog Company soldier John Deals, who had been left behind at the farmhouse during the withdrawal. German paratroopers discovered him lying on the ground, trembling. One of them drove a bayonet into him and left him for dead. Amazingly, the wound did not kill him. After the Germans withdrew, Deals somehow found the strength to crawl toward Carentan, desperately hoping to find help before he bled to death. Eventually, medics located the severely wounded paratrooper and evacuated him to an aid station. Deals survived and lived into old age, but the psychological scars never fully healed. He suffered from PTSD for the remainder of his life. According to those who knew him, he would dive beneath his kitchen table whenever he heard thunder. Speirs carried a lasting sense of guilt over Deals' suffering. He also regretted never recommending some of his men for awards recognizing their bravery during the battle. On the 20th of June, more than 1,000 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne assembled in Carentan's town square. Grateful civilians showered them with flowers and shouted, "Vive l'Amérique!" during a ceremony presided over by Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division. 11 American soldiers received the Silver Star. Addressing the troops, Taylor reminded them that they stood there because soldiers of the division had been willing to sacrifice their lives. He emphasized that while the medals recognized individual acts of heroism, they also honored every man in the division. The living were being celebrated that evening, he said, but there would also be time to honor the dead. 4 days later, Ronald Speirs was promoted to first lieutenant. War correspondent William Stoneman later described the battle as resembling a cowboy and Indian fight fought in a strange land. He observed that while not every soldier becomes a hero, the paratroopers who landed in Normandy came remarkably close to that ideal. Years later, historian Mark Bando offered his own assessment of how the Battle of Carentan and Bloody Gulch were portrayed in Band of Brothers. He argued that both Dog and Fox companies were unfairly depicted as fleeing the battlefield. According to Bando, Dog Company did not break the line during the battle. Fox Company did withdraw, exposing Easy Company's flank, but their movement was a fighting withdrawal rather than the chaotic rout shown in the series. Even while falling back, they inflicted casualties on the enemy. Bando noted that Fox Company was repeatedly criticized because of the withdrawal. In reality, Major Richard Winters lodged a bitter complaint with Lieutenant Colonel Strayer and Colonel Robert Sink regarding Fox Company's retreat and its commander, Captain Thomas Mulvey, a veteran officer who had been with the 506th since Camp Toccoa. As a result of the controversy, Mulvey lost his command. Supporters of Fox Company argued that they withdrew because they lacked sufficient ammunition and faced a greater concentration of German armor than Easy Company. Whether justified or not, that remained their explanation. Winters, however, never fully accepted it and reportedly remained angry about Mulvey's withdrawal for the rest of his life.